Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet Tet morning where a simple bowl of faux, handmade cakes and an unspoken bond reveal the warmth hidden inside an ordinary life. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. In the faint, grey light of an early Tet morning, the kitchen slowly came alive. Thin trails of smoke drifted upward from the stove, carrying with them the rich, familiar scent of faux. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, but inside, warmth gathered around the small space. Tien stood by the stove, steady and focused, carefully ladling boiling water into a bowl before adding fresh green vegetables. Steam rose instantly, clouding the air and softening everything it touched. Jack stepped in from the yard, his breath still white from the cold. The moment the scent reached him, his eyes lit up. He paused for a second, almost not wanting to break the quiet. Tien, you're making breakfast again? His voice was low and gentle, like he was afraid to disturb something fragile. Tien turned and smiled, setting the bowl down on the small wooden table. Please sit, sir. The PHO is ready. They sat across from each other, the bowl between them, radiating warmth. Steam drifted upward, fogging the space between their faces. Jack took his first bite and immediately nodded in approval. He praised the vegetables, the broth, the balance of flavors, almost too much. Beneath the compliments was a quiet worry that Tien might be skipping meals, focusing only on taking care of him. Tien noticed, of course, and gently redirected the conversation. They spoke softly about the garden out back, about how the banana trees were nearly ripe. Tien mentioned staying home today because of medication, their tone casual, as if it were nothing worth worrying about. The calm shifted when Jack brought up the children by the stream, the kids they often visited, the ones he had promised to return to with Tien, with gifts this time. I'm busy today, Jack said after a pause, but I still want us to make cakes for them together. Tien nodded. It was a small movement, but there was a spark there, something warm flickering behind their eyes, cutting through the winter chill. Jack reached out briefly and held Tien's hand. The touch was light, almost hesitant, as if he were passing on a bit of strength before standing up to leave. Breakfast ended without many words, only the quiet crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing filled the kitchen. Tet was close, and though the world outside felt cold and uncertain, inside this small room, their bond burned steady and warm. The door closed softly behind Jack, letting a thin wave of cold air slip back inside. He turned once more, smiling warmly. Tien looks really handsome today. The unexpected compliment lingered in the air long after he walked down the village path. Tien stood there for a moment, waving until Jack disappeared from sight. Alone again, Tien returned to the kitchen and lit a small fire for warmth. Flames danced across their face as they fed the stove with a thin piece of wood. There was a quiet longing in their expression, brief but unmistakable. Little yellow cat, it's so cold today, Tien said softly, crouching down. I'll bathe you later, okay? The cat purred faintly, and for a moment, the gentle words felt like comfort meant just as much for Tien as for the animal. They brought out a basket of sweet potatoes, washed them carefully, and began slicing them into thin pieces. Each movement was slow and deliberate. The steady rhythm of the knife felt grounding, as if every slice carried patience and intention, not just for the children, but for the waiting that came with caring. As the stove warmed the room, Tien mixed flour, sugar, and black sesame with practiced hands. Soon, the scent of frying sweet potato filled the kitchen. Sweet, rich, deeply familiar. The smell wrapped around the room like a blanket. In Tien's mind, images of the children appeared. Bright smiles, loud laughter, small hands reaching eagerly for food. The quiet task became something more than cooking. It was a ritual, a way to stay connected to the children, to Jack, to the simple joys that made Tet feel real. After a moment's hesitation, Tien picked up their phone and scrolled through the contact list. A fragile sense of hope sat heavy in their chest. They called Mrs. Thu. The ringing stretched on, unanswered, before turning into voicemail. "Mrs. Thu, where are you?" Tien murmured. Silence. Determined, they slipped on a jacket and stepped outside, hurrying down the narrow village lane. The cold bit at their cheeks as they stopped in front of Mrs. Thu's old house. The door was locked tightly from the inside. No movement, no light. Tien knocked and called out, their voice echoing against the walls. Only the wind answered. A few neighbors emerged from nearby houses, curiosity and concern on their faces. They shook their heads. "She's been gone for days," one said. "No one knows where she went." Tien made more calls. "Mrs. Liu, Mrs. Hi," but each conversation ended the same way. Confusion, worry, and no answers. The phone fell silent in their hand. Helplessness crept in slowly, seeping through thin clothing, like the cold itself. Tien stood there, staring at the locked door, heart heavy. After a long moment, they turned back. The walk home felt longer, slower. When Tien stepped inside, the faint aroma of sweet potato cakes still lingered in the air, gently pulling them back to the original purpose. They sat by the stove and picked up where they left off. Hands moved again, mixing, shaping, frying, but now there was a quiet emptiness beneath the routine. Still, Tien kept going. Even without reaching Mrs. Thu, the cakes needed to be finished. Each one carried a promise, a bit of warmth, a small way to hold on to hope through winter's disappointments. The door suddenly swung open. Jack stepped inside, slightly breathless, his eyes immediately finding Tien by the stove. Tien made so many cakes. His voice held both surprise and pride. Tien looked up and smiled gently. "Almost done, sir. Sit down." Jack shrugged off his coat and sat near the new stove he had bought, running his fingers along its side. "This stove is really convenient." Tien placed a plate of hot cakes in front of him. "Try them." Jack took a bite and froze. His eyes widened. Crispy on the outside, chewy on the inside, perfectly sweet. He laughed softly. "These are amazing." Tien sat nearby, watching him eat. The tight weight in their chest eased, just a little. Jack held out another piece. "You should eat too. This is your hard work." Tien took a bite. The warmth and sweetness spread slowly, melting away the fatigue of the day. Jack looked at them, his gaze soft. "I didn't know Tien was this talented." The compliment settled quietly, warmly. For a moment, the small kitchen felt like the safest place in the world. They sat together, sharing cakes and small stories, as if time had decided to pause just for them. Outside, the afternoon light slowly softened, fading from pale white to a gentle amber glow. Inside the kitchen, the fire in the stove continued to burn steadily, filling the space with quiet warmth. Jack and Tien sat close together at the table, their shoulders nearly touching. Between them was a wide bowl of dough and sliced sweet potatoes, already prepared for the next batch. They worked side by side, hands moving in an easy rhythm. Tien shaped the dough into small rounds, rolling them carefully, while Jack sprinkled black sesame over each piece. The seeds caught the light as they fell, dark and glossy against the pale dough. The scent of caramelizing sugar and frying sweet potato floated through the air, wrapping around them like a shared secret. Jack exhaled slowly and leaned back for a moment. "Work was still busy today," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I'm tired, Tien." Tien paused, lifting their eyes to him. There was no surprise there, only understanding. Jack stared at the table for a few seconds, as if deciding whether to speak further. Then he continued, slowly, carefully, like someone opening a door they'd kept shut for a long time. "Sometimes I think, one day I want to let everything go," he said. "Just live simply, with you, the garden, the kids, afternoons like this, nothing else." Tien smiled faintly. It was a gentle smile, but beneath it, something tightened. "Don't let me affect your work," they replied softly. "You work so hard to get where you are now." The words were calm, but firm, protective. Jack shook his head and reached out, his fingers lightly touching Tien's hand. "I know how much you've been through," he said, "but I want more time with you. Yesterday, harvesting together, I was really happy." The room fell quiet. The fire crackled softly. The wind brushed against the window. Their breathing slowly synced, without either of them noticing. Tien nodded. In their eyes, something fragile shimmered. "I hope for a better future too," they said, "so we can be together more." Still, inside, Tien kept a small, invisible distance. Not because they didn't want the same future, but because they didn't want to become a burden. They returned to shaping the cakes, their movements gentle and precise, as if smoothing over something unseen. Tet was approaching fast, but right now, this moment, this shared silence, this warmth, felt more precious than any celebration. As the sun dipped lower, orange light spilled across the village road outside. Jack and Tien packed the finished cakes into a clean basket, layering cloth carefully over the top to keep the warmth in. "Done," Jack said with a satisfied nod. "Let's go." Tien picked up the basket, and together they stepped out into the cooling air. The path led toward the familiar clearing by the stream. Even before they arrived, they could hear it. Children laughing, shouting, their voices cutting brightly through the quiet evening. The moment Jack appeared, the kids spotted him. "Uncle Jack!" they yelled, running over in a rush. Their eyes immediately locked onto the basket. Jack laughed, setting it down. "Hands first," he said, pretending to be strict. "Then cake." The children groaned dramatically, but rushed to wash their hands anyway. Tien stood nearby, smiling as they lined up, still dusty from playing soccer. When the cloth was lifted, the smell of crispy sweet potato cakes spread into the open air, mixing with the scent of grass and water. Each child received a piece. They bit in eagerly, eyes lighting up. "So good," one shouted. Another nodded enthusiastically, too busy chewing to speak. Jack sat down on the low steps and pulled Tien to sit beside him. The tiredness from earlier seemed to fade from his face. Tien handed extra pieces to the kids, standing farther back, making sure no one was left out. Their expression was gentle, calm, like an older sibling watching over the group. The empty rice field nearby, still unplanted, had turned into a wide playground. Twilight settled over the clearing, painting the children's faces in soft gold and blue. Jack leaned closer and whispered, "Thank you for the cakes." Two teens smiled, their heart feeling lighter than it had all day. Tet was close, but moments like this already felt like celebration. As the sky darkened further, one of the kids suddenly shouted, "Let's play blindfolded tag." Jack laughed immediately. "All right, I'll go first." The children cheered as they tied a red scarf over Jack's eyes. He stretched his arms out exaggeratedly and took careful steps, pretending to be serious. "Where are you hiding?" he called. The kids shrieked with laughter, darting around him. Tien watched from the side, smiling as Jack spun clumsily, missing everyone by inches. Then it was Tien's turn. The scarf was gently tied around their eyes. The children held hands, forming a loose circle, singing loudly as they moved around. Tien stepped forward, arms reaching out cautiously. When they finally caught someone, laughter burst out all at once. Tien pulled off the scarf, laughing too, watching the kids scatter like birds. Jack placed a hand on Tien's shoulder. "It's been a long time since I played like this," he said quietly. Their eyes met. In that look were memories of childhood, of simpler days long gone. The children slowly settled down, finishing the last of the cakes. They sat in small groups, talking about school, homework, and teachers. A few looked up and asked, "Will you come again tomorrow?" Jack nodded without hesitation. "We will, after you're done with school." Satisfied, the kids began to drift home one by one, their voices fading into the distance. The clearing grew quiet again, filled only with the sound of wind and water. Jack and Tien sat side by side on the steps, watching until the last child disappeared down the path. The day ended gently, without rush. In the busy lead-up to Tet, surrounded by expectations and worries, the most meaningful thing wasn't money or gifts. It was moments like this: shared warmth, shared effort, shared joy. Jack reached for Tien's hand and held it quietly. No words were needed. In that silence lived hope, connection, and the future they were slowly, carefully building together.